Thank you very much. Welcome to the second session of the day. This session is on climate, energy transition, and green colonialism. My name is Hassan Mehedi. People call me Mehedi. I work for a small organization called CLEAN, Coastal Livelihood and Environmental Action Network. It is in Bangladesh, in the coastal side of Bangladesh. So let me start from someone who has extensive experience on climate crisis and climate negotiations, Mr. Soumya Dutta. He will focus on planetary boundaries and material limits.
There is a global, almost it seems to be, the dominant global consensus is development is necessary, development within quotes, and that development depends on more extraction of materials, more destruction of forest, because you have to have development, you have to have this built, you have to have built many more structures, faster trains, faster planes. So that's a global consensus, and it's a manufactured consent. Because if you look at our history not long back, if you look at our history of 100 and 125 years, this was not always the global consensus. Development, a few decades earlier, also included how happy you are, what is your well-being feeling, what kind of environment you live in. All these were part of the what developed state you are in. What we are standing today, where we are standing today, what kind of world we are standing today is not only based on those earlier feelings and earlier conceptualization of development and human well-being. Today, as all of us know, the world is facing a collapse of multiple what we call earth systems. The earth system scientists have been able to identify 9 earth systems, and these are all interconnected. And there are 3 studies of planetary boundaries that many of you might have heard about, and these are major systems which control the earth, its climate, its productivity, its bioproductivity, its life. Everything is controlled by these 9 earth systems. The first study was in 2009, when none of the earth systems were broken. Second was 2015. Let me quickly come to the last, 2023. There was a global study, and it shows 6 out of these 9 earth systems have either been breached or about to be breached. And in that, the system or the cycle of biodiversity, how many species do you have in the world, how many different species, and what is their abundance, how much do they have in the world, that's probably we have gone beyond redemption, and that's collapsing. All of these are large scale, global scale systems, so it takes time for them to completely collapse, but this is probably now beyond recovery stage, possibly. That's what the scientific consensus is. Why are we going into this state? Because one, as I said earlier, the very idea that our development has to be tied to more extraction, more burning. Fossil fuels we have always blamed fossil fuels for the last 50, 60, 70 years. Fossil fuels do deserve blaming. But supposing we had been extracting and using only 1 billion ton of coal or similar amount of oil, there would have been no climate crisis. There would be no collapse. There will be additional air pollution. Air pollution is also a major crisis in the southern countries. There will be more air pollution, but far lower. So it's not a question of just what you are using. That's important, but it's not just that. It's how much, at what rate we are extracting, we are destroying nature, and how much we are actually destroying our own life support systems. Let me come to a few things where a lot of people have questions. If we really slow down on this development based on extraction, burning, and waste dumping, because these 3 are intricately connected, the more you extract, the more you destroy, more you burn or use, and more you dump into the environment as your waste product, as our society's waste product. Where do they go? Who consumes this? And in much of this production, including China is the world's manufacturing hub. including China, much of our southern countries do produce a lot. Where do they go? If you look at the material consumption of different countries, the area that we are right now in, South Asia, our per capita average material consumption is around 7 to 8 tons, average of South Asia. The northern countries, the rich countries, US, Europe, Japan, Korea, South Korea, all these countries, their average per capita material consumption is 40 to 50 tons. And all of these are embedded. Not all of these will show up as material on their rooms. It is embedded. Lot of material is consumed to give them something very sophisticated, something small but highly material and energy intensive. In the last, it's always also said, oh, there are so many people in the world has increased, so population has increased, we need more. That's a myth. In the last 125 years, world's population has increased 5 times from 1901. The material, construction material extraction and consumption has increased 36 times. So it's not for serving the people's need, it's for serving luxury consumption. Like Asad pointed out, or someone pointed out this big building here. I think Hemanta pointed out that big building here which is not being used. So this is what the extraction, consumption, burning and dumping is contributing to. Can we do better? Since the time is short, I'll come quickly to that without giving other examples. Can we do better? In the last 3 decades, the jobs, the employments, livelihoods, that's one point I also wanted to highlight. There have been also logics that this development creates a lot of jobs. Yes, it creates a few jobs. Let me give an example of, that's a very illustrative example. And we have been doing these fights in multiple places. A big coal power plant, modern, creates 700 jobs. It's a real life example. It displaces 7,000 independent, well-paid livelihoods of fish workers, of small-scale salt panners, of farmers. So yes, this development creates some jobs, but it destroys large number, much larger number of independent, nature-friendly livelihoods. So the other factor is connected with where is this money going to come from if we have to do all this? And how much money do you need to create jobs? Because many of the trade unions and others are concerned about jobs. It has also been shown, that last point, that in the last 3 to 4 decades, the money that you need to invest to create one job, in fact, I don't know about the global average right now, it's not in my head, but in India, that money has increased 16-fold. One job creation today needs 16 times as much money in India in so-called modern industries than it used to demand 30, 35, 40 years ago. So all this is because of a particular economic political model, financial economic political model that we have been laid into. And let me just finish by this, again saying, emphasizing, this was not an automatic natural route. If you look at the consumption, energy consumption, material consumption, the destruction, 1950, around 1945 to 55, 1950 was a turning point. After the Second World War, the whole consumption of weapons, war materials were turned into consumer materials. And we were brainwashed. We means our grandfathers and fathers and the whole generation of us and our children. We are brainwashed that consuming and possessing and owning more, even with a lot of problems associated with them, is development. So it's a manufactured concept. Today, with more consciousness, with more education, with more understanding, we can overturn that and we can have better human development. We can have well-being with much less consumption, which will be within the limits of Earth's capacity, because from 1971 onwards, we have actually passed the Earth's total productive capacity. Today, we consume 1.8 times what the Earth can provide on a sustained basis. So there is no choice. We have no second Earth. We have to come back. And how we have to come back, how we can come back, is very well known, but we have to fight the system that prevents us from going that route. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Soumya. Soumya focused on the embedded emissions, embedded consumption. Also, he focused on the differences between consumptions in global south and global north. As he said that global north consume more material, like 5 times more material than the global south. It is similar in energy systems also. In South Asia, we consume around 635 kilowatt hour of electricity per month, per year, where it is around 8,000 kilowatt hour in global north. So we have another speaker who can more focus on this governance, economic model, and participation perspectives of this whole system. In her speech, Ms. Suraya Jawoodeen, okay? Okay, she will focus on public pathways as a response to energy poverty and basis of the democratically controlled energy system as a public good.
I'm here representing TUED, which stands for Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. It's a network of unions and civil society organizations that work to advance a democratic control of social ownership of energy, but it's in ways that must promote solutions to the climate crisis and address energy poverty and deal with the degradation of land and the people, as well as attack on rights and protections. So it works on a number of fronts because all of these are interrelated issues. TUED was set up in 2012, and we have a number of trade unions affiliated to us from all over the country, both north and south. Now, issues of climate crisis is difficult for trade unions. It may not be the case in Sri Lanka, but certainly in the part of the world I come from, trade unions struggle in the economic climate with retrenchments, restructuring of labor, production, and we're losing lots of jobs. We're on the back footing, unions are weakening, and there's low density of union membership. It may be different here. And in that kind of economic climate, unions tend to spend less time on issues of climate justice. And in some cases, they completely disagree with the issue of how you respond to that. But we are required to respond to the climate crisis, greenhouse gas emissions, and because these need to be reduced if we want to avoid the degradation of our environment. The climate crisis is a threat to our jobs and livelihoods, and basically is a threat to the security of working class people everywhere, but in particular the global south. What we're witnessing today is not a global energy transition away from fossil fuels. We are seeing an energy expansion, and much of that energy expansion is still based on the usage of coal, oil, and gas. So I totally agree with the first speaker. And our economic growth models and its demand for energy, and most of this new energy is supplied by fossil fuels. The country I come from, 78% of our energy provision is through coal, and we're a large coal exporter, and we mine coal. So the energy system is out of control. Anyone that argues that, I agree. It responds to capitalist laws of supply and demand, an accumulation that doesn't meet human needs and environmental needs. And if we cannot control how energy is generated, managed, and used, we won't adequately offset the impact on climate change. So the current situation demands a very urgent response from the global south. Global south, as I'm sure all comrades will agree with me, is disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. The impact of warming temperatures, floods on agriculture, on our jobs, on our health, on our environment is worse in poorer countries because our infrastructure is poor. Recently in South Africa, we had flash floods, something we're not used to, and it completely wiped out entire schools because the schools were so poorly built in the working class areas. And I suspect that's true across the South. So Tuet's principal call is for something we call the public pathway. It's a call for our states and governments to take steps that begin to deliver an energy transition that is anchored in public investment, not private investment, not in World Bank investment, and an expansion of public assets, one that's anchored in a framework that ensures energy sovereignty of our states, policy independence of our states, and a progressive internationalism that builds solidarity across the South. Decades of climate and energy transition policies have catered for the needs of private interests, so I think we agree on that. So in the midst of energy expansion, in sub-Saharan Africa and large parts of the South as well, we're seeing energy poverty. Okay. Energy poverty where millions of people reside. In Africa, our energy entities are debt-ridden. And I mean, in relation to the previous debate as well, not all the debt is international debt. Not all the debt is World Bank, IMF debt. A large part of our debt is also local debt. So the debate on scrapping debt, I think, is a very complex debt. We lack skills, we lack infrastructure. And this has happened out of decades of underinvestment through World Bank policies. Our just transition is largely reliant on commercial loans. We call this blended finance. It mobilizes private investment, and these are not coming without conditionalities. And we are now seeing independent power producers whom we have to buy our energy from. Debt levels in our energy entities are high. They're largely based, which has resulted in foreign ownership. So what we call the Green Structural Adjustment Framework, the previous panel dealt with this on de-risking, the blended finance of creating an enabling environment for the private sector is unsustainable for the global South. But what we probably require is an offensive against these neoliberal policies. Our passive, defensive struggles are not taking us forward. We need the global South South governments to develop a new international energy order. In the same way we ask for a new international economic order, we need to develop collective policies that create a new architecture for energy. It must deliver energy as a public good so that everyone is entitled to energy and there's no World Bank logic of user fees for all services that are provided. Our financing has to stop de-risking. It has to transfer assets from private corporations back into public hands. The one thing we do say as Tuet is this is a complex issue. Where does the money come from is a complex issue. There are no short-term solutions to bringing energy back into the public system. We've got to stop unbundling and privatizing. The finances are huge, but we must start moving to developmental finances. We must reduce our debt levels for the finances. We've got to reclaim the energy in a way that's demarketization. There must be a decommodification, and we must renationalize. We understand renationalization is not easy. Where energy entities are still in public hands, much of that is still based on business principles where it's a user fee recovery. So we're saying not on that model, but on a model of everyone's entitled to energy as a public service. If we don't do this, and if we don't have policy independence, we won't have independence as states, and we can cooperate. We don't underestimate the complexity of the technology use. We think we're going to have to, in the long term, agree that there's going to have to be a mixed use of technologies because not one single technology can provide all the energy that's required. The issue of what is the economic model must not be based on a degrowth of our economies. It doesn't have to be based on a capitalist model of private consumption for an elite, but degrowth is not going to lift the levels of the poverty we have in the South. I know I'm abusing the time. So I had many other issues to raise. One last point is, as TUED, we have launched a South platform for unions of the South to come together. And despite the difficulties of how we approach climate change, we do agree on we don't want privatization, we don't want neoliberal policies, and we don't want debt-ridden energy entities. And that does give us a limited amount of things to work around.
Thank you, Suraya. Suraya focused on many very important and alarming issues, some of the issues. Hamza, mic is yours.
I would like to start by saying that because our struggles are interconnected, because nobody will be free unless everyone is free, we need to acknowledge the reality of genocide taking place in Gaza today. A genocide committed by a deeply racist apartheid and settler colonial state of Israel with the active support and complicity of Western imperialist powers, from the United States to the European Union, France, Britain, Germany, and others, but also the silence of other powers like China. And in here, the words of the Colombian president, Petro, are really on point. At the margins of the climate talks in the Emirates in 2023, he said the genocide and the barbaric acts being committed against Palestinians is what await the millions of people fleeing the south because of the climate crisis. Gaza is a rehearsal of the future. And he is absolutely right, because the global ruling classes are willing to sacrifice millions of black and brown people, millions of white working class people, so they can maintain the accumulation of capital, they maintain amassing wealth, and they maintain hegemony. And we have seen this at various points during the vaccine apartheid, during the pandemic, the migrants that are being sacrificed in the seas and crossing borders, but also we see it in the climate summits where the climate finance, the climate reparations that the South needs are not forthcoming. So we need to really connect the dots in these issues. So to address that climate crisis, the global ruling classes, the wealthiest amongst us, are proposing the old ways, but in a new green cloak. They talk about the green economy, they talk about sustainability, they talk about green growth, but all of this is basically green capitalism. It is accumulation by dispossession, or maybe much more accurately, decarbonization by dispossession through privatization, commodification, and financializations that we heard from different speakers this morning. Corporations, the ruling classes, governments in the north, continue proposing false solutions, profit-making false solutions. They call them market-based mechanisms, carbon markets, carbon credits, which are a euphemism for carbon permits, permit pollutions, because these solutions are not resolving the climate crisis, are not reducing the CO2 emissions, and in fact, they are greenwashing those polluters and the perpetrators of those environmental crimes, while generating new injustices in terms of green grabs, expelling local people and indigenous communities from their lands in the name of conservation projects and sustainability. But at the same time, what we are seeing through those false solutions is the externalization or the shifting of responsibility of tackling the climate crisis from the north to the south. Some of us call those dynamics green colonialism or green neocolonialism. The other point that I would like to make is that we're not really seeing a green transition, but rather we are seeing an energy expansion. Fossil capital and green capital intermeshed with each other, and more often we see fossil fuel companies investing in green projects. Renewable energies are not displacing fossil fuels yet in the global capitalist economy. We heard Trump lately saying drill baby drill. We saw in the last few months that BP, one of the biggest fossil fuel companies in the world, just reneged on its climate commitment. Basically, they stopped all investment in green projects, saying we need to focus on extraction and exploration for fossil fuels. These people are really taking us into the abyss. But if we accept the premise that there is a kind of a transition, that transition that they are talking about, first of all, is a corporate-led capitalist transition aimed at generating new profits and maintaining the accumulation of capital, and also creating new frontiers of accumulation. That transition is not led by working people and is not in their interests. Energy, in that vision, energy is still seen as a commodity to be traded and sold to the highest bidder and secured by the most powerful nations, while around 800 million people do not have access to electricity. In attempts to decarbonize, what they call decarbonization, the richest of this world are trying everything to maintain their hegemony and to secure the resources needed for that transition. Critical raw minerals, water, land, reproducing in that process those neo-colonial dynamic and extractivist practices. A lot of us call this green colonialism, green neo-colonialism, or green extractivism. There are many examples all over the world, and I'm sure it's the same story here in South Asia. But in my region, there are many big export-oriented projects, building big solar plants and wind farms in order to export green electricity to the European Union, so they can have cheap green electricity and achieve their climate targets, while the local populations are being dispossessed, while their resources are being taken away from them. And these projects are privatized through what is called public-private partnerships. And I always say this, those public-private partnerships, that word sounds very good, but it is a euphemism for the privatization of profits. So the private companies running those projects have their profits guaranteed, while if those projects are losing, those losses are socialized to the citizens, to the communities, and to the people. But there are also new frontiers of accumulation in this green transition. I'm sure you heard of green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is being put forward as this miraculous bullet that would replace gas. There are many projects in the global south that are being promoted to export that green hydrogen by using the land and water of local communities, so it can get exported into countries like Germany. Namibia is one stark example of those neo-colonial dynamics, because the Namibian people, 45% of them do not have access to electricity. So if we, or more accurately, the global ruling classes, are gonna continue in the same ways of producing and consuming, what is called the imperial mode of living, we're gonna create new green sacrifice zones, or sacrifice zones for sustainability. So the richest amongst us will continue excessively consuming and then using yachts and jet sets, while people are being impoverished. I won't have time to go into alternatives, but we may discuss that in the discussion. But I would like to finish by really encouraging us always to ask critical questions when we think about economic projects and economic activities, not just in the energy sector, but in every sector. In terms of energy for what and energy for whom? Why are we building those projects in the first place? Are these gonna be serving the interests of the local communities or the interests of the big capitalists? And then who owns those projects? Who decides? And who wins and who loses? And whose interests are being served? These questions are really fundamental for us to shift the narrative so we can dismantle green capitalism and green colonial dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamza. Thank you very much. What are the concerns from South Asia in this global context? Radhika Chatterjee, mic is yours.
So I will talk about some policy issues that shape the energy transition discussions at the international level, which then eventually shape the discussions at the national level, regional level, and the local level. Now, before I get into the policy issues, the biggest dilemma of implementing a just energy transition is that on one hand, we in developing countries, even developed countries, but we in the dilemmas that we are facing, biggest dilemma is that one, we have to reduce our fossil fuel use, but also deliver public goods, basic public goods, and address impacts of climate change, including rising temperatures, which in turn would again require us to use more energy. Now, going to the international policy context, in the UNFCCC, that is the climate talks that happen once a year, countries meet, some 194 countries meet once a year, and they also meet, meet intersessionals also, which is, so basically twice a year, they're going to meet next month. But there's this process called the global stock take, which happened in 2023. This global stock take is about taking stock of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, which is part of the climate talks. Now, one of the things that came out of the first global stock take was this set of global targets related to scaling up of renewable energy, besides the transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. Now, in other areas of the climate talks, there's a lot of focus from the developed countries where they insist that any conversation around just energy transition should focus on implementing these global targets that was provided for in the global stocktake decision. Now, you may ask, what is the problem with that? Because if the requirement is to phase out, to move away from fossil fuels, but then there is still a problem there, and I'm going to use the Indian context to try and explain why that is a problem. That kind of an imposition of global target is a problem for developing countries. Now, in a country like India, which is heavily dependent on coal sector, it is the second largest producer and consumer of coal in the world. It relies on coal for meeting 55% of its primary commercial energy needs and 70% of its electricity needs. The taxes and levies from the coal sector, they form an important source of revenue. It also contributes to the revenue of India's railways, which in turn contributes to the country's GDP. The number of people employed by the coal sector are, the estimates vary. The highest estimate is that of 15 million people. That's just the coal sector. Now, that is not the only sector which is dependent on coal. There are other sectors which are dependent on coal. There's mining sector, power sector, manufacturing sector. So you can, these are all contributing to the economy, contributing to jobs. The top three consumers of coal in India were electricity, steel and washery, and cement. And growth in cement industry is driven by India's needs for infrastructure development and urbanization. Again, both of which are activities that are important for the country to meet its developmental needs. Iron and steel sector contributed around 47% of all inputs in the building and construction sector. And there's the micro, small and medium enterprises. These are again the small scale industrial activities that happen throughout the country, and that happen in every developing country. So they contribute, in India they contributed 35.4% of the manufacturing output in 2022. They are also heavily dependent on coal. So to talk about scaling up renewable energy and reducing coal use, we really have to think about how all these other industries are going to make that shift. So one crucial thing that they need is to upgrade their technology, something that they can then shift to using those kinds of technologies which help them move away from coal and use renewable energy. That would require huge sums of finance. Now, coal companies, one more aspect of coal companies in India is that they also, the public sector coal companies, they also deliver some sort of public goods to the people who are living in those coal towns. So, these goods are like schools, hospitals for local communities. So closure of coal plants, public sector coal power plants, would also have an impact on provisioning of those public goods. Now, so this is one side of the story. The other side is if you want to scale up renewable energy. Now, that's because as of now, the alternative source of fossil fuel is renewable energy. And that would require finance, technology, capacity building. Now, it would also, so for example, if you want to set up solar power plants, it would require huge amounts of land. Now, these lands, now, in a country like India again, the per capita availability of land, it's a meager 0.002 square kilometers. And the per capita arable land is 0.01 hectares. And the number of people who are dependent on agriculture in the total workforce is 45% of our total workforce is dependent on agriculture. And agriculture supports around 42% of the livelihoods of the total population. So, there's this very crucial trade-off between setting up, how do you use land? Do we use it for setting up renewable power plants? Do we use it for agriculture? And how do we balance out these needs? And, our agriculture sector, I mean, while a major part of it is focused on subsistence agriculture, but also there is this, the grain production which then supplies grains for the public distribution system of the country, which is the largest public distribution system in the world. It provides grains to around 813 million people. So in, even while a country like India and other developing countries deal with these kinds of dilemmas, they also have to address various kinds of disenablers that they have to deal with due to the international frameworks of governance. Now, these are, trade-related, finance, debt, intellectual property rights, unilateral measures. I'm just going to focus on investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. So I'm just going to focus on three. One is the intellectual property right regime. There is, the global intellectual property rights regime under TRIPS. It prevents developing countries from accessing technologies at affordable prices and at a quick pace. We saw this during COVID-19 when developing countries had a tough time accessing vaccines which were needed to be accessed at a very quick pace. And this situation is going to be similar. It is actually similar in the context of climate, where developing countries require technologies to carry out their transition and adaptation. That is basically dealing with climate change. So that's the TRIPS regime. Then there is the ISDS regime. That's the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which basically allows investors to sue governments. And this adds a financial burden on developing country states. If you look at the figures of ISDS cases, in the last 10 years, the number of cases have increased, and a majority of the cases are filed against developing country governments by companies that are based in developed countries. So, and a lot of these, 1/3 of the ISDS cases, I think in last year, they were around fossil fuel, filed by fossil fuel companies. So basically, a developing country says, I don't want to do a fossil fuel expansion because I want to talk about climate or I want to do my climate action. The fossil fuel company goes and files the case under ISDS. So that's one kind of disenabler. The other is TRIPS. And the third that I'm going to talk about is CBAM, unilateral measures, like CBAMs. CBAM is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism of the EU. Now, that's, there are studies that have found that CBAM, the impact of CBAM in reducing global CO2 emissions, it's going to be very less. It's going to be around 0.1%. That's it. But in terms of real income terms, the benefits are going to be accrued. Like the benefits will happen mostly in developed countries, particularly the EU. Now, in India, CBAM is projected to impose a tax burden of 25% on average, which amounts to around 0.05% of the country's GDP. So this is, this is the general context in which we have to sort of see the challenges of energy transition that developing countries have to deal with. And even while we see all these challenges, we have to keep in mind the inequalities of global north, global south in the contribution to the problem of the climate crisis. So I'm going to end just with two figures of the historical emissions in the context of South Asia and North America. In South Asia, the share of global population, South Asia's share of global population is 24%, and their share of historical emissions between 1850 to 2019 is 4%. And if you look at North America, the figures are reversed. North America's share of global population is 5%, and the historical emissions is 27%. So that is the extent of inequality in terms of contributing to the problem of climate change. Thank you.